Welcome to Goodmanson Construction's online presentation of ADA compliance. My name is Tim Prigge and I'm a project designer with Goodmanson Construction. Our presentation is an overview of ADA compliant exterior accessible routes with the goal of establishing those elements we need to consider when determining if our building or location is ADA compliant. What is ADA? ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It became a federal civil rights law in 1990. ADA prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities and applies to jobs, schools, transportation, and all public or private locations that are open to the public. An example of a private location would be a private golf course which hosted events for the public or allowed non-members on site. So why is ADA compliance important? ADA compliance is important as it limits or even reduces your business's exposure to financial risk. ADA compliance is regulated by the Department of Justice and enforced through lawsuits. If your building is not ADA compliant, you are liable for the repair and replacement costs with the possibility of an additional financial penalty. When you add to that the potential of facility downtime, you risk a decrease in revenue as well. So grab a pen and paper and let Goodmanson Construction guide you through exterior ADA compliance. Federal ADA as compared to the Minnesota State Accessibility Code. ADA is a federal law. It is enforced through lawsuits by the U.S. Department of Justice. Federal ADA, the most current version, was adopted in 2010. It reflects the American National Standards Institute's 2003 guidelines. The Minnesota State Accessibility Code is enforced by state code officials. It was adopted by the state of Minnesota in 2012 and reflects the American National Standards Institute 2009 guidelines. General rule: where the differences in federal ADA and state accessibility codes occur, adhere to the more stringent of codes. Federal and state example of the general rule. The Minnesota State Accessibility Code requires access aisles between accessible parking stalls to be a minimum of 96 inches wide for both van and passenger cars. Federal ADA standards allow for a 60-inch minimum access aisle for van and passenger car accessible parking. By now you're wondering, is your building compliant? ADA offers no grandfather provisions, meaning if your building was built in the 1960s, you still must comply with ADA. ADA, however, does offer a provision referred to as safe harbor. Safe harbor means if your building is compliant with the original 1991 ADA standards before March 15, 2012, you do not need to make any alterations. However, if you alter elements in compliance with the 1991 standard, safe harbor no longer applies. This provision is applied on an element-by-element basis, meaning only altered elements must comply with the most current version of ADA. An example would be when restriping a parking lot that includes seal coating, ADA compliance is required for our parking stalls and access aisles. This next slide shows us an example of the no grandfather provision in federal ADA. This building, located in Minneapolis, was built before 1990. It is not currently ADA compliant. This business owner is facing a lawsuit for lack of ADA compliance. When considering exterior accessibility as it relates to ADA compliance, let's start with our parking lot. Federal ADA lists a guideline for us, which lets us know, depending on the number of parking stalls that we have, how many are required to be passenger car accessible and how many are required to be van accessible. When considering our parking lot, we can refer to the parking lot chart that Federal ADA offers to let us know how many parking accessible stalls we need. But let's look now at the size of those stalls and access aisles. Minimum parking stall width is 96 inches or 8 feet. The minimum access aisle width is 96 inches wide or 8 feet for the Minnesota State Accessibility Code. Access aisles can be shared by accessible parking stalls. Access aisles must be level according to Federal ADA, meaning slopes cannot exceed 2% in any direction. And access aisles must be located at the nearest possible route to the entrance. Now that we've considered the number of parking stalls required by Federal ADA and the dimensions of those stalls and access aisles, let's now look at signage. Signage is required at the head of stalls and access aisles. If signage obstructs pedestrian walking surfaces, signage can be permanently placed on the surface. Another consideration for signage is that of van accessible parking. As we saw in our Federal ADA parking chart, there are requirements for the number of van accessible parking stalls. Those stalls must be marked with the international symbol of accessibility for vans. Van accessibility is a Federal ADA requirement, but not a Minnesota Access Code requirement. Thus, in this instance, we must adhere to the more strict guideline and use the Federal ADA requirement of van accessible parking signage. After considering parking as it relates to Federal ADA, we next need to turn our attention to accessible routes. This next slide shows one example of a consideration for an accessible route. It is a parking island. Many times parking islands will be located in the direct path of travel, in which case we need to establish an accessible route. Those routes can include a curb cut through, which is a minimum of 3 feet wide, or curb ramps with a minimum 4-foot level landing at the top in the direction of travel. Another consideration when reviewing accessible routes are curb ramps. The next slide shows one example of a curb ramp. Please keep in mind curb ramps come in several different configurations, but for the sake of our consideration, we will use a standard pedestrian curb ramp. As we see in the slide, the entrance to the curb ramp cannot have slopes greater than 5% within 2 feet of the curb ramp. Pedestrian curb ramps must be a minimum of 36 inches or 3 feet wide. Curb ramps shall not have an entry slope greater than 8.3%, which equals 1 inch in every foot. Curb ramps shall not have flared sides greater than 10%, or 1 inch in every 10 inches. Curb ramps are required to have a 36-inch or 3-foot level landing at the top of the ramp. Curb ramps must be located outside the access aisle, meaning they cannot protrude into vehicular traffic. A third consideration when reviewing accessible routes are walking surfaces, which include sidewalks, of course. They shall not have a running slope greater than 5%. Running slope refers to the path of travel. They should be a minimum of 48 inches wide to meet the Minnesota State Accessibility Code, and a minimum of 3 feet wide to meet federal ADA. Walking surfaces shall not have a cross slope of greater than 2% or 1 inch for every 4 feet. Our final consideration when determining if our accessible route meets ADA compliance is that of entryways. Entryways shall be level and not have cross slopes greater than 2% or 1 inch for every 4 feet. Level landings are required at doorways. However, level landings for doorways are door, style, and swing dependent, meaning the dimensions of our level landing change from door style to door style. In review of federal ADA compliance, let's consider the following things previously mentioned in our presentation. When differences between federal ADA and Minnesota State Accessibility Code occur, follow the stricter of the codes. Provisions do exist if ADA compliant alterations aren't technically or financially feasible. Be wary of uninformed contractors, engineers, and architects who are not well versed in the elements of ADA compliance. When we consider ADA compliance, let's focus on slopes, dimensions, locations, and exceptions to rules. Please keep in mind that this online presentation is only an overview of the rules and regulations associated with ADA compliant exterior accessible routes. Every building is unique, which is why Goodmanson Construction is offering each individual who has viewed this presentation a free one-on-one consultation with one of our ADA compliance specialists. To schedule a consultation, please call or visit our website and refer to the presentation. We can be reached by phone at 651-636-4996 or via our website at www.goodmansonconstruction.com. The phone number once again, 651-636-4996, or our website, www.goodmansonconstruction.com. We'd love to hear from you and help in any way with your ADA compliance needs. Once again, my name is Tim Prigge, and I'm a project designer here at Goodmanson Construction. On behalf of the whole Goodmanson Construction team, we'd like to thank you for your participation in viewing our presentation of ADA compliance.